my mantra around this is actually pretty straightforward, which is do what I want, when I want, where I want, with whom I want. And if I can do, some elements of those four things every day, I feel like I'm winning. The main things to keep in mind, irrespective of what the actual business pursuit is, you have to be comfortable with you and what you bring to the party. So rather than defining yourself by the organization that surrounds you or the title that you might have had previously, particularly if you're transitioning out of a company role, you have to let go of those things and instead define yourself by you, or you have to learn how to partner and reach out beyond the boundaries of your own little organization to partner with other people. You really have nothing to sell but yourself and your own experience that you can bring to bear on whatever client issues or problems need to be addressed. Fundamentally, you have to, with as low ego as possible, but you still have to have confidence in yourself.
Welcome to The Inner Edge, a podcast about leadership, self-mastery, resilience, and reinvention. So Ian, I can't tell you how honored I am to have you on the show again. You are one of my, honestly, and I'm not just saying this to flatter you, you're one of my favorite people in terms of human beings, the way you show up in the world as a leader, as a person. I know when I worked in your organization, I felt like I was one of the most important people in your organization, and I wasn't at the time. So you just had this unique way of making people feel really special. And so anything that I can learn or the listeners can learn from you, I know is really valuable because you don't only talk about these principles that we're talking about, but you actually live them and embody them. And to me, that's really what the inner edge is you have to do some inner work in order to get there. So thank you. I'm honored to have you on the show again. And we're going to have a conversation. What I've wanted to talk about with you, and I think this is something that is a really important conversation to have, and it's about transitioning. And you've been through several transitions, career transitions. And one of the big ones was you went from being the CHRO of a very large company to starting your own company. And that's a huge transition because you've got what's the word? People use, it's the golden handcuffs. It's the mothership is there always. And it's really difficult taking that identity and changing it and then going out on your own. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about, first of all, why did you choose to do that? And I want to ask you what that was like.
Thanks for having me, and happy to talk about it and play a small part in your mission. I mean, you're spending a lot of your time trying to help other people become better leaders, and I'm all for that. So thanks for allowing me to play a small part. I think in terms of the question you asked, there were a number of elements going on at the same time. Speaking of transitions, every company goes through changes in leadership. As a CHRO, you're a big part of that. For example, going from one CEO to another. And each one of those transitions, including the one that I went through, you have to, almost like a marriage, decide, are you ready to sign up once again for the next gig, right? Because usually the next gig with a CEO, if you're a chief HR officer, is in some ways going to be different, and in some cases significantly different than the person you were working for previously, even if it's an internal succession, which in my case was the case. But I also recognize that the skill set needed, the level of focus and attention, the priorities were going to be very different. And I had to kind of look at myself in the mirror at the same time that the CEO was trying to figure out who to surround himself with, and say, do I really want to do this again? And I think we both came to the conclusion after some discussion about it that he would benefit by bringing a different team in around him, not just in the CHRO slot, but many of the other positions on the leadership team, which he did ultimately do. And I would benefit a lot by going to the next thing. Now, at that time that I was going through that process, as you can imagine, I was thinking about, do I want to do another CHRO role someplace else, in a different environment? And I did consider that. But simultaneously, I was also thinking about this entrepreneurial side of me that kept popping out, over time where I
Which I
had to,
must say, wait, I'll say as someone who worked in your organization, I don't think it was over time. I think it was always there. I mean, you were always this entrepreneurial type of person.
yeah, I think so. I'll take that as
Yeah,
a compliment, but
yeah.
certainly at minimum, it's kind of who I was, right? And so, in order to work in a large, complex, somewhat bureaucratic environment and be happy doing that, you have to tamp down some of those entrepreneurial tendencies, at certain times. And I found myself, especially as my career progressed, becoming even more and more energized and motivated by the entrepreneurial side of creating things that were new and different and trying those out and doing them with a minimum of bureaucracy, which is harder to do in large, complex companies. So, as much as I loved my corporate career, and I did, and I learned a ton, and I feel like I was able to contribute here and there, I also felt like a way of testing myself for the next transition was going to be starting my own business. Now, just to finalize that thought before I see what more questions you have about it, I also recognized in myself I had to get comfortable with a number of things that were going to be very different, not the least of which was, did I actually have the ability to sell anything to anybody? And would I be good at that process? And would I actually enjoy it? The other thing that I had to test in myself was I had a very, long career, 28 years of working for big companies where I was surrounded by high quality people and a fair amount of resources that you could use to get things done. And of course, when you're starting your own business from scratch, there's almost none of that. It's basically you, with a telephone and maybe some email and a few other ways of reaching out to people. And you have to build something and create something from nothing. I had no clue whether I would be good at that and enjoy the more independent aspect of that work rather than the more collaborative work that I was able to do in leading teams of people and working together with lots of great people, including you, in the larger company environment. So those were a couple of aspects of the transition that I really had to think through.
Yeah, and those are huge elements, right? So they're not just simple things. I mean, I know we talk about them, but when you think about being a CHRO in a company, in a large company, the title itself gives you credibility. And so you immediately are seen a certain way. People behave a certain way because you are the CHRO of the company. When you start your own company, it's a little different, right? I mean, you're competing with all these other people who also have their own companies, who also have the title of CEO. And so it's not there's not that instant credibility. Now you're bringing it with you, obviously, from what you've done in the past, but you're building your credibility as you go. It's a little different. So I'm curious, how was that? I mean, how did you navigate that?
Well, you first have to recognize, putting ego aside, that what you said is actually very true, which is you really have nothing to sell but yourself and your own experience that you can bring to bear on whatever client issues or problems need to be addressed. I had to get comfortable with that. For example, I always laugh when I think about this now because it was 15 years ago when I started my business, but I spent a lot of time thinking about what I was going to call my little firm, ended up with exec Excel group after lots of thought on a lot of different things. And I constantly tell people now, I just would have been much better off calling it Ziskin Consulting because fundamentally what people were buying and paying attention to, rightly or wrongly, was me and whatever
Sure.
credibility they thought I had, whatever experience they thought I had. So one lesson learned in all of that is, fundamentally, you have to maybe with as low ego as possible, but you still have to have confidence in yourself and what you're bringing to bear on behalf of clients. And then, honestly, you have to figure out whether you're going to break through all the clutter in some way, to the point you were making a minute ago, because it's a crowded space, especially in my business where I was doing a lot of leadership coaching like you have done, and a lot of leadership development work like you have done. I mean, there's a lot of really good people and some bad ones too, I guess, but a lot of really good people out there who do what we do. And so you have to start to get your head around, how are you going to distinguish yourself in some way? In my particular case, not that I was so smart or unique. I think the thing that helped me was that I had a good network of colleagues, relationships across a wide variety of different companies and industries. But I also spent a lot of time and energy expanding that network as I was building my business. And not everybody's good at that. Some people are good at delivering the work, but they're not necessarily great at cultivating the relationships and building credibility. I had to either learn how to be good at that or discover that I actually was fairly good at it and capitalize on that in some way.
So were there days where you just said you wanted to throw up the towel and say, why am I doing this? I'm just curious. Maybe
Yeah,
not, but
yeah. Well, there were some of those days. I think probably the most frustrating experiences were more around people's lack of responsiveness, which is not necessarily a function of, their interest in me or whether they even thought I was any good at what I did, even though at times it did feel personal. What I came to recognize it, by and large, it's not personal. It's that people have a million things going on. They're highly distracted. They themselves work in, large organizations that are somewhat bureaucratic, that take time to make decisions. And so there were certain days where you felt like slowness or lack of responsiveness was somehow a referendum on, me personally, but it rarely was. I think it was mostly the fact that you're swimming into, a large bureaucracy with very busy people in senior roles, and it takes a long time to get them to pay attention. And sometimes you have to have the patience, which is not my forte, but also the determination to keep following up with and to some degree chase after people who need to be chased after. If you don't have a pretty high tolerance for that, chances are you're not going to be successful as an entrepreneur, not just as a coach or a consultant, but almost any type of entrepreneurial venture. You have to be okay with, follow up and follow through and reminding people and chasing after them up to a point. And I had to figure out what that point was that worked for me. And it took me some time to get comfortable with that.
yeah, so people aren't chasing you. You're having to chase after them. And what's interesting, I think, about that is that it's humbling because I have had that experience as well. And what's really interesting, I have two major clients right now that they ghosted me for 5 years. And then all of a sudden, right, it's like, "Oh my gosh," but all the time that I was reaching out, they were, like, pretending like I didn't exist, and it was not personal at all. It's just at that moment, that wasn't the focus, and then when the focus became that, they think of you. So, that's a really, really interesting point. Okay, so the transition. So if you were to sum that up, what would you tell people who are going through a transition, who are making an identity shift? Because there's something changes in your identity as well, because you've got to see yourself a little bit differently.
Yeah, there's a lot that does change in your identity. And I think the main things to keep in mind, irrespective of what the actual business pursuit is, is a couple of things. One in particular being you have to be comfortable with you and what you bring to the party. So rather than defining yourself by the organization that surrounds you or the title that you might have had previously, particularly if you're transitioning out of a company role, which oftentimes defines us, you have to let go of those things and instead define yourself by you and what you bring to the table in terms of experience and expertise and the ability to help people solve problems and get things done, and frankly, roll up your sleeves to do the work, not just delegate it to other people. And that's kind of an acquired taste. Not everybody is good at that. So I would certainly advise anybody who's listening to us talk about this, if they're thinking about making that kind of transition, one of the first questions you have to ask yourself is, am I actually comfortable representing me, yourself, rather than representing the company, that I was part of. The other thing that I think you have to also be really good at, because you're not operating in a larger infrastructure like the big company kind of roles, is how comfortable are you at either doing things completely on your own, which some people are, or in my case, my style is a little bit different, which is I tend to have a lot of highly collaborative relationships with other colleagues who I partner with on things, but they don't work for me. I don't work for them. We're both independent. We're running our own businesses, but we figure out where it makes sense to connect and collaborate. And becoming good and comfortable at that is also an acquired taste if you're going to be a more entrepreneurial kind of person, where you don't necessarily have access to all the resources or expertise that you need within your own smaller firm. Whether it's, you are the firm, or even if you have a couple of people working with you, obviously there's not enough breadth of expertise in your own little business to be able to cover all of the things that you're going to need to cover to support a client. Therefore, you have to learn how to partner and reach out beyond the boundaries of your own little organization to partner with other people. I think I was pretty good at that because I've always been a somewhat collaborative personality, but I didn't have any idea whether any of that would translate into running my business until I did it and tried it, made mistakes along the way, and got better at it over time, hopefully.
Yeah, and it looks like that was a skill that was so transferable from your corporate life into the business life. So, another question I want to ask you, because I'm cognizant of our time here, and you talk about knowing yourself and all those things. So there's some inner work that I'm thinking. Obviously, this podcast is called the Inner Edge, right? That where you get your edges inside. What inner work do you think you had to come to terms with or learn about Ian that helped you along the way?
Yeah, it's a really great question, because in my case, I had to do inner work around a few, I'll say unrelated, but they really were related in terms of what are the things that are required to be successful. They just seemed very different areas at the time. One was this issue of, could I actually roll up my sleeves and do the real work myself, because I'd been surrounded by teams of people who I'd, had the benefit of being able to, share the pain with, over many years in big companies. And then suddenly you realize when you're running your own business, it's basically you, unless you go out and hire somebody to be a sub to you, which I certainly did do. But I had to learn how to do a lot of things myself that I wasn't sure if I could do. And I had to ask myself, was I really willing and prepared to do that? Right. The second thing was I had to
And what was
admit
your
that,
answer? Obviously, your answer was yes, I would assume, right?
yeah, my answer was yes, I was willing to
Bravo.
do it. But I very quickly learned, partly on my own and partly as a result of good advice from other people, that you should really focus on the things that you like doing and are good at, and then hire people to do all the other things. And one mistake I see entrepreneurs make a lot, especially at the beginning when they're not earning a whole big income yet, is they're very reluctant to pay for things. They want to do it all on their own to try to quote unquote save money. But I actually find that to be a huge mistake, partly because they distract themselves from the things they're really good at and do a lousier job on something that someone would be much better at. And they, more importantly, deflect all their time away from building their business and talking to clients and prospective clients, because they're overly focusing on, developing their website or coming up with, graphics and logos for their business cards or whatever it
It
is they
takes
may be.
much longer if you're doing it on your if you try to do that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm not suggesting, throw away money that you don't have, but what I am suggesting is invest in yourself a little bit up front by hiring people who are better at things than you are and focus on what you're good at. So that's really my last point to your question, which is, part of the inner work is really deciding what you're good at. And you're not good at everything. No one is. And what are you really good at? What do you really like spending your time on? And build your business around that rather than, thinking that you're supposed to offer something that you're not particularly passionate about or don't really have the skills, or you don't want to say no to a client, who offers you some piece of business and you think your mission is to say yes, yes, yes to everything because you don't want to turn business away. That's actually a kind of a false positive, as I like to think about it, because if you spend too much time working on stuff you're not good at or you don't like, it's another way of distracting yourself from the things you are good at and that you enjoy. And you're much better off being selective and saying no or no thank you, or referring the business to somebody else who's better at it than you are. And you concentrate on the things that are going to be the core part of your business. Deciding what is going to be the core part of your business is essential.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I think it also impacts your credibility if you're just doing everything and you're mediocre at everything, right? And so you're not as good at the things that you actually are good at. And
Yeah,
so,
no, yes, I totally agree with that. Now, maybe to contradict myself for just 30 seconds, I did get a lot of advice when I started my business from people who were very focused on one thing, who said, you're better off as a coach or a consultant, being known for one thing. And, I think that's good advice for a lot of reasons, for a lot of people, but I didn't follow it. I didn't follow it for a couple of reasons. One was because I was coming out of a chief HR officer role, which by the definition is quite a variety of things, right? And then the other thing, which is more my personality, was I felt like if I overly focused on one thing, I might get a little bit bored too early in the game. So my strategy was to have a portfolio. Now, when I say portfolio, I don't mean 50 things, but I do mean, 4 or 5 things that were going to be part of my business. Was very important to decide what were those 4 or 5 things. Now, over 15 years, as you can imagine, those things have morphed some. But it was very important to start with a core set of areas like coaching and leadership development and some advisory board work and that kind of thing that I knew I was going to do, and zero in on those things and market myself accordingly and say yes to those kinds of projects and no to other things that were not in that core set in my portfolio, and refer that business to other people. And that's actually turned out to be a very effective approach, at least for me.
yeah, no, there's a lot of wisdom there. Uh, now you're like many other people, or you're in the middle of another transition. So you're pivoting a little bit in terms of transitioning what you're doing, your career. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's been a challenge too. Most people who know me would say I'm failing retirement, even though I've been, very vocal with people about, wanting to quote unquote retire, and certainly slow down and do fewer of the things that I really enjoy, and also travel less, at least for business reasons. My mantra around this is actually pretty straightforward, which is do what I want, when I want, where I want, with whom I want. And if I can do, some elements of those 4 things every day, I feel like I'm winning. That's success for me. But what it doesn't translate into, and this is just, my personal philosophy, I'm not thinking about retirement in the context of, move to Florida and play golf, full time or something like that. That's just not who I am or how I'm wired. For somebody else who thinks that's attractive, by all means do it. In my case, what I'm trying to do is, still coach a little bit, but have a few clients, not dozens. Um, Also do some things that used to feel like work, including the fact that I got paid for them. And now some of what I do actually is more pro bono, giving back to the HR profession, leadership profession, working with students, graduate students, for example, at universities, those kinds of things where for me, it's really all about, the phase of life where I have the flexibility and the freedom to give back, to people and causes that are important to me. And that might look like work to certain people, but it doesn't feel like work to me because I'm not spending a whole lot of time chasing after people for money, which is very freeing. And I recognize that I'm fortunate to be in a situation like that in life where I don't have to worry about that anymore. And I'm taking full advantage of that by spending my time on the things that really matter to me. So that's the transition that I'm going through now. And, you were talking earlier about what kinds of skills and what do you have to be good at and doing the inner work to really, become good at certain things. The inner work I'm going through right now is two things. One is learning how to say no even more than I did before, because if I say yes, then I end up being busier than I really
Doing
want to be.
exactly what you were doing, right?
Right, exactly. So I have to be more disciplined about the things that I say yes to. And the other thing is just, once again, redefining who you are as a human being. I went from, quote unquote, big company, senior level executive as a chief HR officer and whatever that meant in terms of, how you define yourself to 15 years of running your own coaching and consulting business as an entrepreneur and having a different identity, but still having an identity that goes along with those things. And now I'm learning how to have an identity as somebody who's, quote unquote, a retiree, in the third act of their life. And, I'm 67, but I don't feel like I'm 67. And, so I have a lot of energy, things I like to do in the world and ways that I'd like to contribute, and learning how to do that in a channeled way that doesn't involve me working 75 hours a week is what I'm learning how to do now. That's my next
The
act.
transition, right.
Right.
Well, it's interesting, Ian. I have to tell you this, that one of the guests that I'm going to be talking to later today is a founder of something called the Encore Career Lab. And, he reinvented himself after 50, and he's started a company that helps people that are in their 50s, 60s, and beyond do their encore act, right? And one of the things that we're going to talk about is that in 1935, around when the retirement age of 65 was established,
Mm.
the actually lifespan of people was 62. So 65 was the retirement age, and basically you would be dead and then you would retire. And that has changed dramatically. And yet we haven't updated that. I mean, I'm not saying that people should retire. I mean, people can retire whenever they want, but I think that even that is a little outdated in terms of how long we're living and what people want to contribute to the world. So,
Yeah, I think it's very outdated. I mean, not only medically and demographically, because people are living longer and are healthier longer, but I think there's a lot of people, certainly people that I'm around, who want to contribute and have a lot to contribute. I'm actually part of two groups right now. One that I help co-found, and then the other one that's new, but I'm a member of. It's basically, senior level people, in most cases coming out of larger companies, who are retiring from those roles and trying to figure out, what their next act or two acts are going to look like and how to contribute and give back. And continuous learning is also something that's extremely important to people now. Also wellness, and longevity. People are spending a lot of time thinking about and focusing on their own health and wellness so that they maximize the quality of their life for however many years they have left to live it. These are all, I think, fairly new things, that people are openly talking about and wanting to share with others and learn from other people about how they're doing all of this, including ways that people are spending their time and what kinds of things they're learning that are new to keep themselves, active and engaged and their brains still working. And it's really, in a way, kind of energizing and stimulating to spend time with other people who are at a similar stage of life that I am and learn from them and how they're choosing to spend their time. And some days, even though I don't consider myself to be a lazy person, I scratch my head and I think, wow, I must be lazy because some of these people are doing amazing things and putting a lot of time and effort into it.
Yeah, and there's a piece of, I think, just rounding this out, there's a piece of giving ourselves grace and permission, or giving yourself grace and permission to emerge into the next whatever that is. And so I think the high achieving folks that you're talking about, it's hard to do that. And so learning in that transition, there's that grace and that space that we haven't really learned how to give ourselves.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And one common theme, not only for myself, but among these other people that I'm starting to hang around with a little bit, is getting comfortable with not being busy all the time, right? I mean, especially in a corporate life, I think people almost pride themselves. How are you doing today? Oh, I'm busy.
Right.
It's almost the way that people respond.
Badge of honor. Oh,
Right? Yeah. I mean,
busy I am. Right.
unless I'm exhausted and busy and my phone is ringing off the hook and I'm answering 5 million emails and texts and chat threads, somehow I must not be important. Well, all of a sudden you realize that, you do have more control over your time. If you are pretty good at saying no and you're doing fewer things, you should actually have some space just to relax and reflect and take care of yourself, exercise, etc. And, for extremely quote unquote busy people, it doesn't feel as busy anymore. And that's not a bad thing, or at least I'm having to, rewire my brain to accept and appreciate the fact that not being busy all the time isn't bad. And it doesn't mean that you're a slacker. It means that you can actually enjoy yourself in ways that you didn't previously have the time and the flexibility to do.
Yeah. So, and that's part of redefining it, redefining identity, right? I could talk to you all day. I could talk to you a lot more about this. I just want to thank you for sharing your wisdom here, because I do think what we're talking about is right there on the inner edge. It's tapping into this place inside of yourself that is capable of making these transitions and actually redefining your identity at every phase. So I really thank you, Ian, for sharing and being so upfront and honest and transparent with us today and sharing your journey.
Great to be with you. Thanks, Janet.